Do most modern people completely misread the Bible because they don't have a supernatural worldview? Well, Michael Heiser definitely thinks that's the case, and he talks about it in The Unseen Realm. Let me tell you what I thought. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. All right, I have here The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. He is known, obviously, for this book, but also he has a really pretty popular podcast called The Naked Bible, which I like. So I've known about him and his work for a while and finally got into reading this text. And I'm going to take you through my normal format, which is the main idea, the research, the readability, and the reasonableness. So the main idea of The Unseen Realm is pretty well captured by the subtitle, which is Recovering the Supernatural Worldview of the Bible. But this book, it really does focus on this supernatural worldview idea, but it traces it really through a lot of the biblical literature, which is pretty impressive because it's not a super long book, and I'll say more about the readability in a minute, but it is very readable. It's pretty impressive how much material is covered in a relatively speaking, a small book. But the main idea is that the biblical writers, especially the writers of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, especially them, but the New Testament too, the writers of those texts had a very, very supernatural worldview, meaning that, in particular, one of the big themes Heiser traces is this idea of a divine council. So the idea that the God of the Hebrews, Yahweh, was the head of a council of divine Elohim, of divine beings. Elohim is the Hebrew word. And that this God being the head, the CEO, you could say, the head of that council of beings, is a theme that runs through a lot of the biblical story, big picture, including the rebellion of divine beings, which become the Nephilim, which is a really weird text in Genesis 6, including implications for the Tower of Babel, including implications for the conquest through the book of Joshua. He argues really intriguingly that a lot of the conquest was actually to root out some of the descendants of these divine beings who had crossed the human barrier. And implications on into the New Testament and who Jesus was claiming to be and what Jesus was claiming to do by kind of waging a war on these rebellious divine agents and what it means to be in Jesus's body or the church today. So it really traces, and that's just like the tip of it. There's a lot more in this book that I couldn't even comment on, but that's really the main idea, is that what is this supernatural worldview, particularly the divine council idea and this rebellious divine agents idea. How do those ideas kind of carry out through the entire biblical story, meta-narrative, you could say? And then what does that mean for how we read, or more likely misread, the Bible today when we don't even think in those terms? That's what The Unseen Realm is about in 2 minutes. Okay, so the research behind it. Heiser, I knew he was a scholar, but I got to say I was pretty impressed with the depth of research that he brings into this project. Meaning that he has done a lot of heavy lifting himself with peer-reviewed publications about things like the Hebrew language, and he's no lightweight when it comes to his own scholarship, and he obviously brings that in and footnotes it to a lot. But also there's a lot of just referring to a lot of really deep scholarly work to buttress some of his claims, and some of his claims are maybe a little idiosyncratic, or at least not mainstream in terms of, if you're a mainstream Protestant evangelical especially. And so he brings the receipts, so to speak. He does cite stuff. he cites journal publications that are written in German. I mean, he cites stuff that's not super accessible or easy to get to, just to kind of show the depth and rigor of the work he's done to really get into specifically the linguistic work with Hebrew and some of the cultural background work. So pretty impressive level of research brought into this project in this book, which leads into the readability, which is going to be maybe surprising to you. This book is amazingly highly readable. It's probably I don't give numbers or scores for these categories in these reviews, but if I were, this would be the highest kind of I could give it, because it's strikingly readable. It's written in a very accessible, almost not conversational, I wouldn't use that word, but it's written in a very, very approachable, accessible style. The chapters are extremely short, which that for me always makes a book very, very readable when the chapters are short for some reason. The chapters are very short, covers a ton of topics, but the footnotes are scholarly, as I said a minute ago, but the style of the main text itself is very, very approachable. So That's important to know, because if you are someone who knows about Michael Heiser, but you've known of him as a scholar, or maybe someone you feel like he's just too smart for you or something, and you've maybe been intimidated by this book, don't be intimidated by it, because the style is real. I honestly could see giving this to most people, even if you're not super well versed in biblical literature, but you're interested in the history of it. I could see most people reading this, which is really impressive given the scope of the argument and the amount of material that he tackles, which leads me into my final comments on the reasonableness of it. This is one, I don't know if this is a critique or what, but in some ways, and I find this a lot with books like this that are taking a really big swing, but also trying to stay very readable in their approachability and style. A lot of books that try to thread that needle, like Unseen Realm, I would definitely put this book in that category. Like Unseen Realm, a lot of these books struggle, and in some ways the approachability of it is also the weakness of it at the same time. And so he covers so many categories of issues. He covers the translations of very specific words. He covers the archaeology in certain cases. He covers the textual history and the background, the cultural background that's informing, the ancient Near Eastern worldview, and comparing it to things like Babylonian and Ugaritic religion. I mean, there is just a ton in this book, and the chapters are short, as I mentioned, and he breezes through so many topics that occasionally I was like, okay, I need to know more about this before I'm going to be totally convinced, because he kind of walks through. For example, there are chapters where he talks about a word or a concept he just basically says straight up, this has been translated wrong. And the common conceptions of these words are just completely wrong in probably every other sermon you've heard in your life. And he makes some pretty bold claims in some places, and then steps through it very quickly as to how he got there. And there were times where I thought, okay, I'm going to need a little bit more to chew on here. Now, in his defense, he frequently says in a footnote, okay, go to my website where you can get really more into the nitty-gritty of it. So I don't want to fault him too much for that, but I do want to say going into the book that it's almost like drinking from this fire hose, and combined with the fact that it is a really, really significant argument he's making that is potentially paradigm shifting. Sometimes I felt a little bit of a wrestling match there as I was kind of trying to really grapple with the stuff that he's saying. So I guess that's a critique. I don't know if that's too heavy of a critique, but be that as may, that's something that I walked away from the book with. But I want to end by reiterating the fact that this is a serious work of scholarship that is potentially paradigm shifting. I mean, I think if I had to just pull out one really fundamental, important insight that is argued very compellingly, and I was persuaded by the divine counsel idea. I was completely persuaded by the divine counsel motif. I think he is completely right about that, and that's not something I was really ever taught as someone who's done a lot. I actually went to seminary. I have a seminary degree on my wall. I was never taught that. And it does, I think he's right, that it carries through the entire biblical story and has implications for a lot of the sub-stories within the biblical library. And that alone, if nothing else, I think there's a lot of other really interesting material here, and I'm still wrestling through some of it. A lot of it is very, very well argued, but the divine counsel argument alone is worth the price of this book, I would say. I think that it is a powerful, powerful piece of argumentation, and he brings the scholarship to it, and he makes a compelling case. And it does have implications for how one reads the Bible and understands the biblical story in a really, really, real profound way. So yeah, I do have a very high opinion of the book, all things told, even with some of those wrinkles that I mentioned. But those are my thoughts on The Unseen Realm by Michael Heiser. Great book in biblical studies in that world, if that's something that you're interested in. So I hope that you found that helpful. If this is a book that you've thought about picking up but haven't for one reason or another, maybe this helped you wrap your mind around it a little bit more and see if it's a book you might want to spend some time with. I do highly recommend it. Michael Heiser's The Unseen Realm. As always, thank you for watching.